Welcome to FRESHImage Presents. In its Declaration on Christian Education, the Second Vatican Council stated, "A Christian education does not merely strive for the maturing of a human person, but has as its principal purpose this goal, that the baptized, aware of their calling, learn not only how to bear witness to the hope that is in them, but also how to help in the Christian formation of the world that takes place when natural powers, viewed in the full consideration of man redeemed by Christ, contribute to the good of the whole society." Fast forward nearly 70 years later, we find that our Christian institutions of higher learning seek not the transfiguration of the world, but rather to keep up with secular universities and train students to be only economic contributors in society, shirking any responsibility for students' holistic human flourishing. Perhaps one would argue that it's a struggle to balance holistic human development and career advancement while your secular counterparts climb up the ranks. But this is the wrong approach. It reduces students to means to an economic end, and it teaches them that not only is it okay, but the preferred way to view themselves and others. Sadly, this is nothing new. Cardinal Newman sensed this very thing nearly 200 years ago as he gave a series of lectures on higher education titled "The Idea of a University." But he took it one step further. For Newman, moral development means nothing if it is not aimed towards sainthood. It's true that good humans are also good workers and good leaders in their communities, but more importantly, good people who reflect the very goodness of God heroically answer the Christian calling to transfigure the world and reconcile all things to Christ. So, let's learn how we might answer this call and how we might also accompany those around us, our children and our students, in answering it as well. In today's FRESHImage Presents, John Henry Newman on Educating Saints.
Friends, to a day and age when young people are counseled to take an educational path that will lead them to success in life, St. John Henry Newman offers a very different approach to thinking about the purpose of education in his classic work, The Idea of a University. For him, education is not about accumulating knowledge in a specific area that enables one to land a good-paying job, or even one that will find the individual in an affluent place in society, though these certainly may be side effects of getting an education. Instead, for him, education is about the pursuit of knowledge in and of itself, not for the purpose of knowing, but for the purposes of cultivating the human mind and human flourishing. Newman's view of education is thus decidedly anti-utilitarian, and if appropriated today, would certainly disturb the educational machine of our time and place. On the other hand, those who hope to find in this work, authored by an intellectual champion of the Catholic faith, a strongly worded defense of a Catholic education, in the sense that the Catholic faith is overtly present in every subject, may be somewhat disappointed. Newman straightforwardly insists that it is a real mistake to burden education with virtue or religion, as with the mechanical arts. Liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman or lady. In short, as Newman sees it, to educate individuals in such a fashion would likewise fail the intended purpose of education. This, however, is not to suggest that for Newman, the sphere of education is somehow autonomous from religion and the Catholic faith specifically. Instead, for several reasons, Newman suggests to us that the only locus for a real higher education is a Catholic university, and though the end of a liberal education may be the lady or gentleman, the end of a Catholic education is the saint. Therefore, Newman's thoughts on education offer a clear challenge to Christian parents and universities alike. To Christian parents, Newman asks, "Are you doing all you can to ensure your children are being educated with the aim of sanctity in mind?" And to Christian universities, he asks, "Do your programs flow out of and back to the life of the church? Or have you been happy to keep the life of the church at arm's length? Happier to engage in the rat race of the socially elite institutions of higher education?" For the sake of clarity, it is best to discuss Newman's thoughts on the aims of education in two steps, beginning first with his understanding of the nature of a liberal education, and then with the Church's role in said education. Consequently, Though at first it may seem as though the education and sanctification or justification of an individual takes place in separate and autonomous spheres, such an understanding would not be truly representative of Newman's thought. In fact, if such a suggestion would be made to Newman himself, he may well indeed reply with a rhetorical question he once put to the medical students at the Catholic University of Ireland. Considering my vocation as an ecclesiastic, for what reason could I, in that case, have had for having now given some of the most valuable years of my life to this university, except that I felt that the highest and most special religious interests were bound up in its establishment and success? For Newman, the sphere of the university and that of the church, when in proper relationship, necessarily are bound up in and interpenetrate one another in a similar fashion to the understanding he has of the relationships between nature and grace, or faith and reason, or even the various areas of study within the university itself, of which Newman says, "In word and deed, and in idea, it is easy enough to divide knowledge into human and divine, secular and religious, and to lay down that we will address ourselves to the one without interfering with the other. But it is impossible, in fact." This dynamic relationship between the two spheres, then, should be kept in mind as we move forward, the reasons for it becoming clearer as we proceed. In Discourse 5 of the idea of a university, Newman spends some time discussing the meaning of the qualifying word liberal in the term liberal education, noting that it is common to speak of liberal knowledge, of the liberal arts and studies, and of liberal education as the special characteristic or property of a university of gentlemen. He begins his discussion by way of contrasting the term liberal with the term servile, before going on to contrast a liberal education with a commercial education or a professional education. In order to avoid unnecessarily offending anyone, for the Oxford-educated Newman is indeed a gentleman, he grants that no one can deny that the commerce and professions afford scope for the highest and most diverse powers of the mind. That said, as he sees it, this type of utilitarian education, though it perhaps has its place, is for him servile, in the sense that it gets the relationship between the person and the education backwards. For in such an arrangement, it is as though the individual were processed so as to become a cog in an immense economic machine. Said differently, and very bluntly, if the reason you go to school or send your children to school is so that they can get a good job, for Newman, this is tantamount to pledging oneself or one's children to the service of the economy. Moreover, just as any cog begins whole and is whittled away at to fit its proper place and fulfill its function in the machine, a utilitarian education has the same impact on the individual by underdeveloping his or her intellectual potential, and thereby inhibiting his or her flourishing as an individual. For, after all, the economic machine doesn't need flourishing human persons. It needs parts necessary for its own performance and maintenance. In contrast to this servile utilitarian approach to education, Newman tells us that a liberal education, which lives up to its name, will have a liberating impact on the life of the individual. For, he says, not to know the relative disposition of things is the state of slaves or children. To have mapped out the universe is the boast, or at least the ambition, of philosophy. In order to understand why John Henry thinks a truly liberal education has a liberating impact on the life of the student, it is important to examine what he means by the terms universe and philosophy, because for him, the universe is the object of study in a liberal education, while philosophy can be said to be the aim of that study. Just as a liberal education lives up to its name when it has a liberating influence on the student for Newman, a university, by its very name, professes to teach universal knowledge, and thus lives up to its name when it does so. By saying this, Newman is flagging the etymology of the word university, which finds its roots in the word universe. Said more simply, to live up to its name, a university ought to teach every subject, which serves as a means to exploring the universe in its entirety. Consequently, for Newman, a university should be open to teaching any branch of true knowledge, each of which has the ability to strengthen, refine, and enrich the intellectual powers. That said, Newman realizes that in practice this is not feasible or even possible in many, if not most, circumstances due to various factors, including financial constraints, for example. That said, it is important that students have access to a variety of subjects. The two primary reasons for this come out more clearly in how Newman understands the relationship between the various disciplines. As John Henry envisions it, the relationship between the various branches of knowledge, or sciences as he calls them, is a delicate balance between mutual influence and respective boundaries. Newman speaks of the respective boundaries between the sciences by describing what happens when one science or other is not present in the university. He says, quote, "If you drop any science out of the circle of knowledge, you cannot keep its place vacant for it. That science is forgotten. The other sciences close up, or, in other words, they exceed their proper bounds, and intrude where they have no right." End quote. Newman gives several examples of this phenomenon, including some very applicable for us today. For instance, he speaks of ethics being swallowed up and having its territory divided under a treaty of partition between law, political economy, and physiology. Today, just such an approach is a favorite of the so-called new atheists, who try to explain away both religion and morality by appealing to evidence of the hard sciences. For instance, often the discipline of evolutionary biology is misapplied in the form of what's known as social Darwinism, to argue that morality is nothing more than evolutionary adaptation, and thus that the categories of right and wrong are mere social convention. Newman is quick to point out such errors, telling us that when this happens, those sciences would be plainly exceeding their rights and their capacities in seizing upon it, and what's more, they would be sure to teach wrongly, where they had no mission to teach at all. The point being driven home here by Newman is that each science has its own method, its own way of knowing and communicating knowledge, and when it oversteps its boundaries into another discipline's territory, it is sure to go wrong, as it simply does not have the methodological capability of studying an area foreign to it. This is a point of the utmost importance today, when young people believe that the hard sciences have the capability to explain away the truths of the faith, when in fact, the sciences simply do not have the tools to do so. No hard science, for example, has the tools to disprove the existence of the God Christianity professes faith in, period. Full stop. And when someone tries to do so, they have done nothing more than revealed their lack of understanding, for they have made a logical error of the most basic kind, a category error. I would add that the fact that so many attempts of this kind are made and accepted in great numbers today serves as concrete proof that the vast majority of universities today are not providing their students with an authentic university education, or liberal education, as Newman puts it. Now, all of this being said, Newman does not envision the various disciplines being sequestered from one another, for we are speaking of an educational universe, after all. And, just as the various elements of our physical universe continually influence and interact with one another, he envisions an analogous relationship among the sciences. Moreover, such interaction is imperative for a truly liberal education in Newman's view, for lack of communication between the sciences is just as sure to leave the students with a skewed picture as when one science transgresses the territory of another, for, he tells us, the sciences complete, correct, and balance each other. For Newman, the fact that a variety of disciplines are brought into community with one another is precisely the advantage of what he calls a seat of universal learning, for it gives learned individuals zealous for their own sciences the opportunity to learn, to respect, to consult, and to aid each other. Newman's words here reveal two important aspects of his understanding of a university: the unity of knowledge and the importance of community. As Newman sees it, both the students and the various sciences themselves only stand to gain by having such interaction amongst one another. The reason for this is something already mentioned, that is, a truly liberal education takes as its object of study the universe, created existence in its entirety. Along these lines of thinking, Newman speaks of the whole of reality as one complex fact. He says, "All that exists, as contemplated by the human mind, forms one large system or complex fact. And this, of course, resolves itself into an indefinite number of particular facts, which, as being portions of a whole, have countless relations of every kind, one towards another." Accordingly, he describes the various branches of knowledge or sciences as various partial views or abstractions by means of which the mind looks upon its objects. The idea that there is an inherent unity to all forms of knowledge, or that reality is one complex fact, is based on Newman's understanding of God. For as he sees it, the universe has been intimately knit together by its creator. What's more, the creator did not only fashion the universe and set it off on its own. Instead, John Henry says, he has so implicated himself with it and taken it into his very bosom by his presence in it, his providence over it, his impressions upon it, and his influences through it, that we cannot truly or fully contemplate it without in some main aspects contemplating him. This understanding of reality is what will lead Newman to rank theology at the top of the academic food chain. As used here, theology simply means the science of God, or the truths we can know about him put into a system. It is not, as yet, what we would understand as Catholic theology proper, but instead natural theology, an endeavor that has had a place, if not possession, in the intellectual world from time immemorial, Newman says. Of course, this statement reflects Newman's understanding both of creation and of the conscience. Creation for Newman has a sacramental quality to it, bearing the marks of, and in a sense making present, its creator, while the conscience provides the individual with a natural experience of the creator, as it were, in the form of internal discourse. For the conscience, Newman says, is the aboriginal vicar of Christ in the soul. Consequently, the human person has always sought out to learn more of its creator, and it should. For not only is theology, even in its natural form, a proper science for study as Newman sees it, but instead it is the one science which cannot be replaced, and without which no other form of knowledge is completely intelligible. As Newman says, religious truth is not only a portion, but a condition of general knowledge. To blot it out is nothing short, if I may so speak, of unraveling the web of university teaching. This is because, as the study of the creator of the universe, which is the one complex fact and object of the university learning, theology serves both to adjudicate the disputes between the various sciences and bring a level of intelligibility to such a vastly complex network of knowledge. With this understanding, we may be inclined to think that the study of theology would be the aim of a liberal education for Newman. However, while theology is the highest science and plays an indispensable role in the education of an individual, it remains one science among many, required to respect the boundaries of the other sciences. Instead, Newman calls philosophy the aim of liberal education, or the business of a university. Philosophy here should not be understood as the professional academic discipline we would normally associate with the term. As used by Newman, philosophy is, quote, the perfection or virtue of the intellect and the enlargement of the mind. Newman defines it as the ability to communicate the image of the whole of reality to every separate portion, till that whole becomes an imagination like a spirit, everywhere pervading and penetrating its component parts and giving them one definite meaning. It is for this reason Newman will say that knowledge is pursued as an end in and of itself, for it is the indispensable condition of expansion of mind, and the instrument of attaining to it. Knowledge makes the expansion of mind possible, because it provides the occasion for the individual to compare ideas with one another, and to systematize them within the mind, creating an ever more complete mental portrait, as it were, of the way things really are. Here we see the importance of community in Newman's theory of education, mentioned above, come into clearer focus. For as Newman understands it, this ingestion of knowledge and its processing on the part of the individual, which leads to the refinement of a philosophical habit of mind, does not primarily take place in a lecture format. Instead, this process best takes place, John Henry says, when a multitude of young men, keen, open-hearted, sympathetic, and observant, as young men are, come together and freely mix with each other. In such a setting, Newman says, the conversation of all is a series of lectures to each, and they gain for themselves new ideas and views, fresh matter of thought, and distinct principles for judging and acting day by day. For Newman, this interaction or clashing of minds is more valuable than receiving the professional opinion of a trained academic, for it is more aligned with our nature as social beings. The result of such a process is the transformation or cultivation of character, such that the individual is brought into increased conformity with its mental nature. In short, it spurs on the flourishing of the human person by bringing its faculties back into proper alignment, expelling the excitements of sense by the introduction of those of the intellect. Moreover, having been availed of such an expansive education and developed a philosophical habit of mind, will curb a tendency towards what we might call intellectual bigotry or pride. For not only will the individual gain knowledge about many things, but just as importantly, gain a real sense of just how much they don't know. For Newman, this makes the individual a more peaceable member of society, again in accordance with our nature as social beings. At this point, we sense that Newman is preparing to make the transition from the realm of the natural to that of the supernatural. However, he resists by insisting that liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman. Given that Newman devotes a large portion to the end of Discourse 8 in his idea of a university to seemingly singing the praises of the gentleman, we might be tempted to think that Newman would be satisfied if the educational system he envisions produced nothing more than gentlemen or ladies. And to be sure, he insists upon the idea that, when conducted in a purely secular fashion, the gentleman or lady is the end product of a liberal education. An individual who, though possessing many respectable qualities, may ultimately, Newman says, become a saint or doctor of the church, or her scoffing and relentless foe. That said, though the gentleman or lady be the product of a liberal education, they are in no sense the desired product of a Catholic education. To be sure, Newman is willing to give a great deal of autonomy to the educational system. This is quite clear throughout the first 8 discourses of the idea, and is stated quite explicitly in a lecture given to the School of Science, where he says that though the Church's magisterial teaching is not to be transgressed by the work of the university, this authority is properly located, quote, at the remote end of a university. In Discourse 9 of the idea, this tone will make a big shift, and he will insist on the necessity of the Church's immediate presence, which we will discuss momentarily. However, it is important to ask why Newman envisions taking such an approach to the management of a Catholic institute of higher learning. I would suggest that there are 3 reasons for this, the first being practical, the second being a more contextual consideration, and the third being more theoretical. In terms of practicality, Newman understands that we are fallen and broken human beings, and being such, for the Church to be so overtly in the face of the student constantly cannot but push them away. This becomes clearer in his treatment of university preaching. There, Newman suggests to those who would preach at the university not to be so blunt in their approach, saying, quote, I see no advantage in a preacher professing to treat of infidelity, orthodoxy, or virtue, or the pride of reason, or riot, or sensual indulgence, end quote. In short, he envisions the university taking a maternal approach to her students, not burdening them with too much, and not treating them as raw material to be cast in a, quote, Catholic mold, in the hopes that they might be forcefully forged into saints, for this approach is sure to backfire. The contextual consideration has to do with how Newman understands the people, and more specifically, the youth of Ireland, who are likely to enter into the university. This comes out most clearly when he addresses the evening classes, saying, the name of Ireland has ever been, and, I believe, ever will be, associated with the Catholic faith. In short, there is a deep-seated conviction within Newman that Catholicism runs through the veins of the Irish people, and consequently, that its youth already come into the university with a thoroughly Catholic frame of mind, such that any knowledge they take in will be instinctively incorporated into said frame. To be sure, in this we are a long way from the Ireland Newman addressed. I can tell you firsthand that many students who attend a Catholic university and who grew up in a Catholic home sadly know very little about the Catholic faith. Consequently, many have rejected it without even having a real choice in the matter. For what they have rejected is a caricature, and they have never been exposed to the faith in all its beauty. This is a consideration to be kept in mind when turning to look more closely at what the Church's role ought to be, as Newman sees it, in his given particular context. As mentioned, the third assumption Newman is making here is more theoretical, and it has to do with how he understands the relationship between the human mind, the truth, and the Catholic faith. In terms of the first, Newman follows Cicero in saying that knowledge is the very first object we are attracted to. The reason Newman is so confident in saying this is connected to his understanding of the conscience. We are naturally attracted to knowledge and to the truth because the voice of truth itself has been speaking to us our entire lives. Thus, we are attracted to it as we are attracted to the voice of a parent, and moreover, we will recognize it when we hear it. Having said this, we have revealed how Newman understands truth. For him, all truth and all knowledge regarding the reality of things is intimately tied up with the God who has created all things, and it cannot be any other way. And therefore, the Church fears no knowledge, but she purifies all, Newman says. Each science on its own has its unique imperfection, and the Church has her remedy for each. Put differently, the Church has the power to assimilate any truth into her body of knowledge, making sense of it according to the truth that has been revealed to her in Christ. And thus, because of her power of assimilation, the Church may operate from the conviction that any truth is a real ally, and that knowledge and reason are sure ministers to faith. In short, precisely because God has intimately tied himself up with all of creation, he is implicated in all authentic knowledge. In this view, all learning, in a sense, operates under the umbrella of natural theology, which, as Newman understands it, finds its natural fulfillment in Christianity. And thus, it is for this reason that Newman will assert that if Catholic faith is true, a university cannot exist externally to the Catholic pale, for it cannot teach universal knowledge if it does not teach Catholic theology. Newman does not stop here, however, for theology, being a science, is susceptible to the same mistakes of the other sciences, and thus theology alone does not provide surety that a university will remain Catholic, a reality becoming painfully obvious in our own time and place. Thus he insists that, quote, a direct and active jurisdiction of the Church over the university and in it is necessary, lest it should become the rival of the Church. The wording here is a bit misleading, for it may suggest to us an imposing or restrictive presence of the Church. However, though different here in tone, Newman is not undermining what has already been mentioned. We notice this when, in speaking of the same idea, he tells us that in order to make a university truly Catholic, the Church must breathe her own and unearthly spirit into it, which fashions and molds the organization, and watches over its teaching, knitting together its pupils and superintending its action. Newman here is quite obviously intentionally creating a parallel between the presence of the Church within the university and that of God within all of human history. He even uses the same metaphor of knitting to describe the way the Church brings together the university community we heard him use previously to describe the action of God in the work of creation and his self-implication in it. The result being that only the Church can breathe life into the university and providentially guide it, not intrusively, but in the same manner God providentially guides human history, with patience and long-suffering. In addition to the Church's role as providential overseer of the university, Newman understands there to be a more practical and pastoral aspect of her presence. Newman makes clear in his Discourse on University Preaching that he does not simply expect the church to have office space on campus, but that the campus will have its own church on site. It is here that the students will have the opportunity to avail themselves of the church's sacramental life and hear the word of God spoken to them, calling them both to their terrestrial and eternal vocation. It is precisely the experience of the sacramental life of the church, as Newman understands it, which will transform the mundane experience of education into one which is grace-filled. For here, students will learn how and be given the strength to use their learning to grow in holiness. A few things may be said by way of summary then. First, it is clear that Newman envisions a delicate and harmonious balance between church authority and university autonomy. This balance will differ based upon historical context, and thus, the assumptions made by Newman regarding the population under his care are not applicable to our time and place, which may result in a different balance. Secondly, though the majority of his discussion surrounds the traditional liberal arts, we ought not forget that as Newman sees it, no educational system can be complete without the truth as taught by the Christian faith, which leads to our final consideration. As previously mentioned, in and of itself, a liberal education cannot produce a saint. If authentic, it will produce a gentleman or lady. And when we consider our discussion in its entirety, it becomes clear that, for Newman, ultimately, little is gained by being a gentleman or lady, and thus the formation of gentlemen and ladies is not the aim he has in mind in his discussion of education. To be sure, it is good to get along with our fellow citizens, and as far as possible, we ought to strive to do so, and education helps with that. However, as Newman understands it, we have not been created to be nice people. We have been created to be saints, and this must be our standard in all things. Thus, any education would be incomplete if it did not issue the universal call to holiness to its students and accompany them as far as possible in answering it.
Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
And visit our website, FRESHImage.org, to become a Fresh Image Insider and have our latest resources delivered directly to your inbox.
Until next time, this is Fresh Image, reminding you that you were created to live life to its fullest,
so that you might be a breath of God's fresh, life-giving air to the world.